Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. Calisperasas. Hope you all are doing well and staying safe from all around the world. We're so happy to have you here for our third and final class in our wonderful lecture this week on the synagogues of Greece with the amazing Marcia Haddad Ikonomopoulos. I want to take a moment out and thank Sion Mizrahi and Mizrahi Realty for sponsoring this wonderful three-part series through our Sephardic Digital Academy. Just to let you all know, there are so many other classes through our Sephardic Digital Academy on history, cultural, Ladino language, Sephardic customs and heritage, Sephardic cooking, of course, and a whole lot more. If you're ever interested also in sponsoring a future program, either through the Sephardic Brotherhood or a partner here at Kehillah Kadosh Ioannina, please reach out to us. You can email us at info@sephardicbrotherhood.com to learn more. Now, without further ado, it's always a pleasure to introduce Marcia Haddad Ikonomopoulos, the Museum Director of Kehillah Kadosh Ioannina Synagogue and Museum, also President of the Association of Friends of Greek Jewry. Marcia, whenever you're ready, just unmute and begin to share your screen.
Welcome. It's so good to see all these familiar faces. It's a pleasure. I want to apologize in advance because this is long. Be patient with me. There's a lot of things I didn't cover in the first two, and I want to make sure I cover everything. This is going to be like, if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. I'd like to thank Ethan Marcus for everything that he does. Kehillah Kadosh Ioannina. I'd also like to thank my friend, Dr. Anastasios Mavrakis, for some excellent photographs he sent me, and of course Bob Bedford for the work that he's done and that he shares with me, especially some great stuff he sent me on Kastoria. Okay, let's start. Got to share my screen. And we're ready to go. Okay, this is part 3. Okay. As always, we're sticking with the map of modern Greece as it exists today, and we're going to be doing quite a bit of traveling. We're going to be starting in Thessaloniki. We're going to go down to Veria and to Katerini. We're going to go then from there up to Florina and Kastoria, and short hop and a jump from Kastoria to the island of Rhodes, Kos, Chania, up to Athens, not to stay, but to go over to Chalkis, back to Athens, then to Patras, then to Zakynthos, then to Corfu, and then to Ioannina. And I'm exhausted. Okay, these are the communities that we'll be covering. Basically, what happened is there were stuff that I did on the history of synagogues in certain areas, such as in Thessaloniki and in Rhodes, but I didn't really do anything to bring it up to date. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to cover communities I didn't have a chance to cover the other times. First, we go up to Thessaloniki, which of course is in Macedonia, and is port city. One of the few natural accesses to the northern Aegean, which made it very desirable. Everybody wanted Thessaloniki, and during the Balkan Wars, there was contentions of who would get in there first. The Greeks got in there first, took over the city in 1912. This is what the city looks like now, and the White Tower, I don't know if it's ever been white, but that's the iconic tower there. And this, we're going to be talking in greater detail about the Monasteretan. Oh, God. For some reason, when I touch my mouse, okay. We're going to be talking about the Monasteretan Synagogue, which was built in 1926. And the Jews from Monastir, which is in southern Yugoslavia, it's now called Vitola. That's where my great-grandfather came from. And he wasn't one of the major sponsors of the synagogue. We were not a very wealthy family, but Sarah Aroesti's family were major benefactors of the Monasteretan Synagogue. This was built in an interesting format. This is the interior. When I saw this for the first time many years ago, I was surprised at the layout because it reminded me more of a Reform synagogue, where you had the reading desk attached to where the Torahs were kept. So we have that here. We have the Kahal and the Tava, And this is where the ceremony takes place. The synagogue was recently restored by Elias Messinas, who did excellent work on it. He's a Greek-Israeli architect. This is a close-up of the area. This is where the Ner Tamid is and the menorahs. Another beautiful view of the synagogue. The women's section is now usable. You can actually go upstairs. For a long while, it wasn't. And the Torah scrolls, I can't figure out what those tags are. My guess is that those were people who had bid on carrying the Torah, and their names are in those Torahs that they're going to carry. These are all Sephardic Torahs here. This is a traditional Sephardic synagogue. The second synagogue in town is Yad Lezikaron Synagogue, which really was created to be the place of worship after World War II. And the Monasteriton Synagogue was only used for major holidays or major events. And now it's the Monasteriton is more of a visitor synagogue, and Yad Lezikaron is the synagogue where the Jews worship. If you remember, I think it was in the first or the second of three-part series, I showed you all those plaques with the names of former synagogues. At one time, they were inside this synagogue, but they're not there anymore. This is what it looks like now. It's also a beautiful synagogue. There's no balcony. Women sit downstairs behind a lace curtain. This is another picture of the Kahal. The Jewish Museum in Thessaloniki, which was actually, it was a difficult museum to create, because I remember when they called out and they wanted artifacts for the museum, and there really weren't any around. I mean, so much were destroyed in the Holocaust. The only ones that were around were Jews in the diaspora, and Israel was saying, don't give them the artifacts back in Greece because it's safer with us in Israel. So there was a problem in getting artifacts. And what happened is Nikos Stavroulakis, who created the Jewish Museum of Greece in Athens, actually created many of the artifacts in the Jewish Museum. When you walk inside, it's a beautiful museum. You walk inside and there's an excellent display on past synagogues in Thessaloniki and also on some of the tombstones that were recovered from the Jewish cemetery that was destroyed during the occupation in 1943. This particular tombstone is really very much in the Muslim style, which is no surprise since the city was under the Muslim Turks for a great period of time, over 400 years. These are some of the old tombstones that were rescued from the destroyed cemetery, where now the Aristotle University stands, Panepistimion to Aristotelios. They're very interesting because you can really tell by the decoration what the occupations were. This tombstone over here is someone who drove a cable car. And this one, they think the woman was actually murdered because of the knife. She wasn't a seamstress. And because of the candles and the knife, they think she's someone who was murdered. This is the new cemetery in Thessaloniki. And it was the land was given to the Jewish community at the time that the old cemetery was still in existence. There was a long period of time that the city wanted to reclaim the land where the old Jewish cemetery was. It was in the heart of the city. It was a vast piece of property. They wound up building the university on it, but they gave, before it was actually destroyed, they gave a piece of land right outside the city for the Jews to establish a cemetery. So most of the burials here are post-World War II. The earliest Holocaust memorial in Thessaloniki was inside the cemetery. Considering the tremendous losses, the community felt it very important to have some place to remember. And this is a memorial that was created in memory of the Jewish men in Greece who fell on the Albanian front. And this was created in time to be available for when they returned the bones of Mordecai Frazis from Albania and reinterred him in the Jewish cemetery in Thessaloniki. Officiating at that service was the then rabbi of Thessaloniki, who was also named Mordecai Frazis. He was actually Mordecai Frazis's grandson. This is an overview of the cemetery. There are over 3,000 tombstones here, and there's still room in the back. Now, these tombstones, I had inquired a number of times what they were about, and I got a number of different answers. The consensus of opinion was that these were for people who were too poor to really afford an elaborate tombstone, and that initially they wanted all the tombstones to look alike, but obviously it didn't happen. And so this distinguishes people who didn't have the money for an elaborate tombstone. Along the wall on the left, you'll see some tombstones from the former cemetery that were rescued. And the one on the right is actually very personal to me because this is my mother's cousin, Marcia Haddad, who at the age of 23 was executed by the Germans in Thessaloniki, along with 4 other Jewish men who had tried to escape. So I actually have a stone where I can put the stone in memory of my family when I visit. These are also personal. Hey, this is my Zoom show, so what I show is personal. The one on the left was a friend of mine, Erica Amarillo, Cunha Amarillo, who is the sister of Heinz Cunha, and she was an absolutely lovely woman. She wrote a great book called From Thessaloniki to Auschwitz and Back, and one of the first books written by a female survivor. And as so often happened on these tombstones here, you see the numbers. Let's see if I can move this without moving everything else. This is the numbers that were engraved on her arm. And this became a tradition in Thessaloniki to put those numbers on their tombstone. This is the tombstone of Moises Berlar, who wrote a fascinating book called, translated from the Greek, Jewish, and a leftist. He fought for Ioannina. He was arrested after and incarcerated in Micronesia, which was a very, very harsh island where, this was after the Greek Civil War. He fought on the Albanian front. He then came back, and because he fought for Ioannina during the resistance, he was in prison. There was a deal made with Greece after 1948 that Jewish men, because there were a number of them, who were in prison for fighting in the resistance movement, that they could come to Israel. And Greece said, fine, you can have them, but with the stipulation that they lose their Greek citizenship. Well, Moses fought back for the rest of his life to try to regain his Greek citizenship. He died at the senior home in Salonika, and I used to love to visit him because he'd bring out the mezedas and the bottle of ouzo, and we play Greek music. And I said, this isn't like any senior home I've ever been to back in the States. There are still former Jewish sites in Thessaloniki. This is the former Jewish orphanage over here. And this one here is Villa Bianca. I came across a fascinating story with Villa Bianca because I translated a book that was written by Nina Nachmias called Rita Gilberto. It was about a young child that had been taken from the ghetto in Baron-Hirsch and rescued by a friend of her mother and was put up in a orphanage run by Catholic nuns. In fact, Sister Joseph is a righteous at Yad Vashem. What happened with the Fernandez family who had saved the baby, they had money. They were of Spanish nationality. They fled the city. They went to Italy. They rented a villa at Lake Como. A Nazi realized that they were Jews, and after stripping them of whatever money he could, he led the whole family down to Lake Como and executed them. I got a telephone call years later from a man who was related to the Fernandez family and wanted to know if I knew when they were deported to Auschwitz. And then I told him reluctantly the story, and he thanked me because he said, at least now I know the date that I should say the memorial prayers for them. These are former Jewish sites in Salonika. You have Villa Modiano and Villamordo. These were family residences, and look how magnificent they are. They are now municipal buildings. Here you have the Modiano Market, and this was another house that was owned by Saul Modiano. The Modianos were very prominent in Salonika. They were an Italian Jewish family that settled in the city. The Holocaust Memorial, again a story. This was dedicated in 1996 because Salonika was named the cultural capital of Europe that year. And many people said, great, cultural capital. What are you going to do about acknowledging the long and large Jewish presence here? So the city created this Holocaust Memorial and then located it far off the beaten track. The only ones who could find it were those that were desecrating it. Finally, they moved the memorial and they moved it over to Platea Eleftherias, Freedom Square, where the Jewish men were rounded up in the summer of 1942 for forced labor. It has been desecrated again, but we clean it up each time. Annually, there is a memorial service on the anniversary of the first deportation, which was March 15th, 1943. And the tradition is they march from the Holocaust Memorial down Nikki's, which is right in the center of the city, to the train station where the Jews were put into the cattle cars and sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Jews of Salonika march. The Jews of Salonika descent come from all over the world to join them that day in the march. There are many Israelis that come. And the Christian citizens of the city also march, which I think is particularly important to mention. This is a memorial that's located where the old Jewish cemetery was. It's on the grounds of where now the University of Salonika is located, Panepistimion to Aristotelios, Aristotle University. And what it really was all about is finally getting the city to acknowledge that there had been a vast Jewish cemetery here. So it's written in 5 languages, French, Ladino, Hebrew, English, and Greek, the story of the cemetery, and people will come to visit it. To me, it's a very important memorial in the city. I remember the first time I went there in the 1970s, and I couldn't find anything to even mention that there were Jews in existence in the city. Salonika has now come to terms with its history, and they're doing great things. This is the plaque at the railroad station, also another dedication in memory of the Jews that perished in the Holocaust at the site of where the cattle cars would take them to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this street, this neighborhood here is what Salonika looked like before the fire. It's one of the few areas where you could actually see what the city looked like. I'm going to say goodbye to Salonika. This is one of my favorite photos, to say goodbye to Salonika. And we're going to move over to Veria now. And this is Ethan Marcus's and Marvin Marcus's and Andrews. This is their hometown. This is the Synagogue of Veria. According to legend, this is on the site of the synagogue that St. Paul preached in. According to his own writings, the epistles, he mentions that he went to preach in Thessaloniki, and he was kicked out of the city on 3 consecutive Shabbats. He then went to Veria, and the high-minded Jews of Veria accepted him. Of course, this is not the same synagogue, but it's on the same site, and the mayor of the city offered to restore it because he wanted to make it a Christian pilgrimage site. Long history here too. Elias Bassinas first documented the synagogue, got initial grant money, and then afterwards, unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to do the project. He probably would have done a lot better job. The synagogue is at the end of the street here, and this neighborhood is called the Babuta. I don't know what it means. No one has been able to explain the meaning of it, but that's what the neighborhood was called. Practically all the Jews in Veria lived in this small neighborhood. The houses were attached to each other. Extended families can go from one house to the other. This is another side view of the synagogue and the interior. from what I said before, we would never have our synagogue look like this. The color of the walls, the gold ceiling, but it serves a purpose. There are services that are held here on occasion where Jews come from outside the country and may have connections to Veria, and they can visit. The money that's raised with admittance there goes back to Salonika to help with the maintenance of the synagogue. Another view of the synagogue from the interior. Now, part of the deal with allowing the mayor to restore the synagogue is the Central Board of Jewish Communities gave up the cemetery to the city of Veria, which is something that never sits right with me. This is, again, another view here, another view here. This is part of the Babuta, and there are Hebrew letters you can still see on many of the houses outside. This was the cemetery. It's now an athletic field. And what they did is they placed the tombstones along the side there. At least they didn't destroy them. And this is a close-up of some of the tombstones. And Andrew Marcus said he's going to work on translating these and start a database of them. It'll be great for genealogical research. Now I'm going to go to Katerini. Why Katerini? You probably never heard of it, but it has an interesting story. It had a small, very, very small Jewish population. At the time of the Holocaust, there were only 60 Jews living there, but it was very close to Thessaloniki and Veria. All the Jews of Katerini survived. How did, everybody mentions Zakynthos, they never mentioned Katerini, so I figured I'd give them their little 5 minutes of fame here. This is what the city looks like. It's right on the water. And this is one of the families that was saved, the Yosafat family. The story goes that a call went out to Katerini that the Jews were to be rounded up and sent to Thessaloniki. A local policeman spread the word to the Jewish community and told them to flee into the mountains, which they did, and they were saved. Now I'm going to go up to Florina. Another place that most people don't talk about, and I felt I should mention, there was a small Jewish community there. It's very close to the border of Yugoslavia. There was very close connections in Florina with Kastoria and with Monastir. These are some old photos. The one on the right is actually a group of Jewish school boys and girls. And the one on the left is what the city looked like. It was, again, under the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And again, a traditional Sephardic community. This is what the city looks like now. There are no Jews there anymore. There's no even remnants of a synagogue that once was. This is the railroad station where the Jews were rounded up. They were sent to Salonika and then put on the trains to go to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The cemetery is now a park. On the right, that's where the cemetery was. There's now a children's park there, and it's right across from the zoo. And that's all. There's no sign anywhere that there was ever a Jewish presence there. Kastoria, I know there are people out there who are smiling now and saying, thank God Marcia made it to Kastoria. I thought it would never happen. I love Kastoria, by the way. This is a view of the city, and like Ioannina, it's right on a natural lake. Beautiful swans in the lake. It's a delightful, absolutely delightful place. These are some of the wealthier houses there. The Jewish community there numbered close to 1,000 at the time of World War II. Most of the Jews had started to leave, and many of them came to the United States, including Bokumayo, who was a very prosperous furrier and went back a number of times. It's excellent. If you've seen Trezoros, there's footage from film that he took back in the 1930s that were incorporated into the film of Trezoros. This is before 1912. Kastoria became part of modern Greece in 1913, where Salonika did in 1912, Ioannina and Kastoria in 1913. This is the only picture that I could find of the last synagogue in Kastoria, which is the Aragona synagogue. So you can see they came from Aragona in Spain. Actually, most of the Jews in the city had their heritage from Italy, from the southern part of Italy, which was under the House of Aragon. But according to oral history, they came either through Albania or through the northern part of Italy into Greece and settled in Kastoria, and many of them settled in Monastir. So there were very strong family relations between the Jews from Monastir and the Jews from Kastoria. There was in 1719, and I thank Bob Beckwith for this little tidbit of information, there was around Hanukkah a major fire in the city. You know, there were constantly fires throughout the cities in the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Most of the houses were very close together and they were built of wood. And when the fire started, it would just go through a vast portion of the city. I mean, we saw what happened at Salonika in 1917. Now, there were 4 synagogues at the time. 3 burned down, and the only one that remained was the Aragonese synagogue. This is a picture taken outside the synagogue, young children playing. And these are some family photos from Kastoria. On the left is Berry Nachmias's family. Berry was one of the few survivors of Kastoria. She headed up the survivors group in Greece for a long period of time. She wrote a book called Cry to the Future, I think it was called. I should know better since we published it through Sephardic House. And this is the Mevorak family on the top there. This is taken the Pichion family on the lake of Kastoria. And this was the Kastoria synagogue in Istanbul. The Ottoman Turks had a practice of very often uprooting Jews from one part of the empire to populate another part of the empire. So there were groups of Jews that were taken from all over Greece when they came in, and they took a group of Jews from Kastoria, transplanted them to Istanbul. The synagogue is in the Balata section of Istanbul and still is in existence. This is the Jewish quarter in 1941. The Jewish quarter was built, by the Ottoman Turks. Both the Jews and the Christians didn't have easy egress from the city to make sure they didn't get out, I guess. And the Jews lived in a section that went up a hill. Now, when it rained, the water would flood down the street. So, of course, the more affluent families would have the best houses on the top of the hill. The houses were built in 3 floors. The bottom level was used mostly for storage. And since many of the Jewish men in Kastoria were itinerant merchants that would go to the local fairs, they would leave on Monday morning, come back on Friday. So they would have either their horse or their donkey would be housed on the ground floor. Then the floor above that was the communal rooms for eating and a salon where things were moved around because they were large families. So if during the day when it was used for eating, they would bring up the mats that were used for sleeping, but the top floor was really where most of the people would sleep. And it also depended on the time of the year. When you wanted to stay warm, you were on the middle floor. When you wanted to have ventilation during the summer, then you were up on the top floor. Most of the men in the community were involved in commerce and textiles, furriers with very popular furs from Kastoria. This is a picture of the Jewish community before World War II. It was a small community, and so most of the people you see in these pictures did not survive. On the left is the Matzah, actually Pizzarella Matzah family. And the picture on the right is Lina Russo with 2 of her younger brothers. Lina, if you saw the movie Tesoro, she was one of the stars of that movie. The movie was really a love story that Larry Russo filmed in honor of his mother. Lina was a beautiful woman, and her brother Benny I was very honored to know both Lina and Benny. The Holocaust Memorial in Kastoria was dedicated in 1996 by Jews that came from the United States and created the memorial. And simply it said that in this place on the 24th of March, 1944, the Jewish community of 1,000 Jews were gathered and deported and sent to Auschwitz. Only 35 survived. There's usually an annual ceremony where they, around the 25th of March, they have an occasion where everybody comes to visit the memorial and laser wreaths. Okay, if you thought it was a difficult traveling before, we're now going to go from Kastoria to the island of Rhodes. Now, this may be a hop, skip, and a jump. Now, it actually would take probably driving to Athens and then taking a flight to go to Rhodes. It would probably be a 2-day trip. These pictures were taken of Kahal Shalom Synagogue before the restoration. I was honored to be able to, nominate Kahal Shalom to the World Monument Fund. It became one of the 100 most threatened sites in 1999, and funds were gathered to save the synagogue. It didn't look bad, but what they didn't know is inside those columns there was interior disintegration, literally. It made of porous stone, and through the humidity through the years, it was seeping in. You can see what gave the sign of what was happening here, where the community noticed these patches of water that were coming in and causing stains. The president of the community, Mr. Kovos, of blessed memory, asked me if I could help, and I really have to thank Nikos Stavroulakis, who led me along the way, because he had gotten Es Chaim nominated to the World Monument Fund the year before. So we were able to save this synagogue, which is the oldest still functioning synagogue in Greece. It dates back to 1577. And this is what it looks like now. This is a view from the balcony. On the top, the balcony is no longer in use. And this is a side view of the street leading down to the synagogue. The cemetery in Rhodes is in excellent condition, and that's thanks to the conscientious work of Aaron Hasson from California, who heads up the Rhodes Historical Society. And if you ever go on the net, go to that site. He has phenomenal things there. He has recordings of liturgy. He has beautiful photographs and translations of a lot of the inscriptions. This was a Ladino-speaking Jewish community. These are old stones from a former synagogue that the Jews were forced to move because it was right outside the walled city. And when the Italians came in, they thought it was unsightly to have a cemetery outside of the city. So they made the Jews move the tombstones, and these were collected into the new cemetery. These are some of the old tombstones here. They're very colorful because the epitaphs, every woman was a woman of valor. Every man was a major philanthropist. This is a Holocaust memorial. It's written, it's interesting, it's written in French. The Jews in Rhodes, although they were Ladino speakers at home, they went to the Alliance, many of them, so they spoke French. And many of them also, especially after the occupation, went to the Italian school there. And Stella Levy is fluent in Italian, French, but not Ladino, because that's not, and Ladino, but not Greek. This on the left here is a plaque that's outside Kahal Shalom Synagogue listing the surnames of all the families that were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And on the right is the Holocaust Memorial, which has on 4 sides in French, Ladino, English, and Greek, the story of what happened to the Jews of Rhodes who were deported July 23rd. 1944, and every year on that date they have an anniversary. I attended in 2019, they didn't have one this year, of course, but it was for the 75th anniversary, and Rabbi Negrin from Athens, along with Rabbi El Nakaveh from New York City, officiated at the ceremony. After the ceremony, the community marched down, all the visitors marched down to the port and took a boat to go over to the islands of Kos, which is very close by to Rhodes. Very, very close connection with the Jewish community of Kos and the Jews of Rhodes. Most of these Jews did not come directly from Spain. They did not come until 1522 when Solomon the Magnificent the Ottoman Sultan invited Jews to settle on the island. Now, 1522 is when Rhodes was taken over by the Ottoman Turks. from the Knights of St. John. And so most of the Jews that were settled there came from other cities in the empire. Salonika, you see names like Modiano and Cuneo from other parts of Turkey, the mainland of Turkey, they came over. This is the synagogue in Kos, or at least this was the synagogue in Kos. You can see the Mogen David on top. It's now a public library, but at least the building is in decent condition. There was very few Jews that returned to Kos, and the building, it was their choice to hand the building over to the municipality because it was no longer being used, and it probably would have just fallen apart. This has the Holy Synagogue of the Jewish community of Kos, and this it states from the fact of the dissolution of the community in 1944. This is the cemetery. Now, part of the cemetery is in fairly good condition. The Jewish community of Rhodes goes over on a regular basis to clean up there. They feel a responsibility for this community. But there are still broken tombstones along the side, and there has been vandalism, mostly the stealing of the marble. And there are old tombstones that lie in very bad condition. This is the last burial that took place in Kos in 1986, and it's the last family that was living there, the Menashe family. And again, you could see the connection from Salonika, the family name. And this was, most of the tombstones look very similar to this. But over the course of the years, I guess there just wasn't the money to do what they used to do. Now we're going to go over to Chania, Crete, which is not an easy trip from Kos. Again, we're going to have to fly back to Athens and then fly to Chania. This is the Venetian port of Chania. It's an absolutely delightful place to visit. You know, the Venetians had a practice of what they would do with their Jews, and they put them in a ghetto. So any place the Venetians were on Greek soil, there was a ghetto. In Corfu, in Crete and Chania, and on the island of Zakynthos. This is looking down on the city from up in the mountains. And there were two synagogues. Now, mind you, at the time of World War II, I think the total population of the Jewish community was about 300, but there were two synagogues. One was the Sephardic synagogue, Shalom, and the other one was called the Zakynthos synagogue, which was the Romaniote synagogue. Now, on the island of Zakynthos, they had a Crete synagogue. There was a very strong family and trade connection between Zakynthos and Chania, Crete, even though they were so far away from each other. This is the center picture, is the ruins of the synagogue. Here, and the same as in Rhodes, most of the bombing damage, and the same as in Corfu, came from the Allies, because this was occupied territory. So the Allies were bombing these cities, and that's when the loss of the synagogue here. May 1944, the small Jewish community of Chania, along with prisoners of war, both Greek and Italian, were loaded into the hull of a boat called the Tanis. The boat was scuttled off the coast of Santorini, and everybody drowned. We didn't find out what happened, who caused it, until the British Archives opened up in 1994, 50 years. And that's when the British finally admitted that they had scuttled the boat, not purposely. They thought it was a German subterfuge and that it was carrying ammunition, where actually it was carrying live cargo. These are from the bombing of the island, and the picture on the right was Etz Chaim Synagogue before Nikos Stavroulakis worked his magic. This is Nikos on the right, an unbelievable man. He wrote the cookbook of the Jews of Greece, and I had the opportunity to taste so many of those recipes. He was an excellent cook. He was a scholar. He was an artist. He was impassioned with his heritage. His father was Greek Orthodox Christian, but he was raised by primarily his grandmother, his mother's mother, who was from the Hanan family from Patras. He went to school in Oxford. He was highly educated. He created the Jewish Museum of Greece in Athens, and he restored Etz Chaim Synagogue. He would speak all over the world raising money. Initially, it was honored at one of the 100 most endangered sites in the world in 1998, which with that distinction, you were able to go out and raise funds to complete the project. This is the inside of Etz Chaim. Now, so many people said to Nikos, what did you need a synagogue for? You're the only Jew on the island. But to him, this was a memorial to the lost Jewish community of Chania. But he also created a cultural center. He would have all kinds of events there that would attract the non-Jewish population of the island. It then became a site, a destiny to have your wedding, to have your bar mitzvah. And then when troubles began in France, a group of French Jews decided to relocate and settle in Chania, so they now have a formal congregation there. And every time I've been there are always services on Shabbat. Nikos passed away about 2 years ago, but the Anya, who worked there with him, she keeps the museum open, and when there are people who come for services and have someone to conduct it, the synagogue functions as a synagogue. When Nikos was around, there were services every day. This is part of an exhibit was at the Jewish Museum of Greece in Athens, and these are, on the left are books that a young Jewish girl gave to her Christian friend to keep for her until she returned. On the right are again thimbles and little trinkets that were given by a Jewish woman to her Christian friend to keep for her until she returned. Needless to say, they did not return, but the Jewish Museum of Greece put on a very impassioned exhibit showing the connection. You know, too often we forget there were relationships. We, as Jews, we often talk about the atrocities and the persecutions and the bigotry and the anti-Semitism, but there were people who didn't feel that way. And there were close relationships in a number of these communities between Jews and Christians. And that's important to remember. Here on the left, we have the front of Etz Chaim, and this is the street. They lived in a neighborhood that was called the Veria, as it was Judea in Rhodes, Veria here. And all the Jews lived within 4 blocks of each other. They lived very closely together. In the courtyard in the back of the synagogue in Chania, there are tombstones that Nikos found, and so he put them in a place of sanctity in the back. Tombstones were found all over Chania. There is no Jewish cemetery anymore to speak of. I stayed at a hotel there once, and there was right in the entranceway, there was an old Jewish tombstone, which I asked the woman about, and she said, "Isn't that nice?" And I said to myself, "No, it really isn't." On the left, again, the entrance to Etz Chaim, and this is where you would wash your hands before you went in to pray. Now we're going to go from Chania, Crete, another hop, skip, and a jump. We're going up to Chalkis. We're going to have to fly into Athens, and then we'll cross over the bridge into Veria. Veria is an island that's actually attached by a bridge to the mainland of Greece, very close to Athens. This is shows you Veria here. Now this water here in legend, because this has a role it played in the Peloponnesian War, where according to the currents were changed, and if you got caught the wrong way in the current, your ships could be destroyed. This is a pedestrian walk over the bridge where you could actually walk into Chalkis. Holocaust Memorial. Actually, very few of the Jews of Chalkis perished. It was a small community with very close relationship to their Christian neighbors, most of whom saved Jews in the mountainous area outside of the city. Mordecai Frazis has a statue in Chalkis. That was his birthplace. And this was commissioned by a man who had a diner outside of Detroit, whose name is Stephanos Bakaris. And he was enamored with Mordecai Frazis. He was his hero growing up as a young boy. The legend of Mordecai Frazis riding his horse into battle. So he wasn't happy with the statues all over Greece that consisted of nothing but a bust of Mordecai Phrastes. He wanted him mounted on his horse. And from the Association of Friends of Greek Jewry and Kahal Ikonomopoulos, we were part of the fundraising to enable this statue to exist. This is the synagogue in Chalkis. There were definitely former synagogues on the same site. The thing was, according to the law, and this was in the Byzantine Empire and in the Ottoman Turkish Empire, you really could, it was difficult to build a new synagogue, but you could build one on the site of a former synagogue. So what normally happened if a synagogue was in disrepair, they would slowly repair it and create a new synagogue out of the structure. This is the interior. It's very simple. Romaniote, you can see the not only the Ner Tamid, but you can see some of the hanging lamps like we have in Kahal Ikonomopoulos, and that you'll find also in the synagogue in Ioannina. This is a Romaniote tradition. And where we often say who got what from whom, it was did we take it from the Greeks, did they take it from us? In this instance, there's no doubt in my mind that this was something we took from the Greeks because they look very much like the lamps that you see hanging in a Greek Orthodox church, with the exception that we have the Mogen David on the bottom, and ours are actually memorial lamps that has the name of the deceased and the date of their death, so you can say prayers for them on their Adara. The cemetery in Chalkis is fascinating. On the right, you'll see tombstones that are in a Turkish style. And on the left is the more modern cemetery. There are about 750 tombstones, about 500 of them old. Now, they say here the oldest grave is from 1716. I'm sure there are graves before that. They created a museum from some old tombstones that they found that did not actually have any burials underneath them. So they must have been brought from a former cemetery, but we had no documentation of that. So they created a little museum on the side that you can visit. Now this is a very quick trip. We're gonna go from Chalkis to Athens, just across the water there. No planes involved. And this street here is in Thessaloniki, which is very close to where the synagogues are. And it's a very colorful street with old neoclassical buildings and lots of coffee shops, and a great place to stop for refreshments if you're going to visit a synagogue. This is the older synagogue in Athens, the first synagogue in Athens, which was called the nickname is the Yanotiki synagogue, the synagogue from Ioannina, but it's also called Etz Chaim, which is a traditional name for Romaniote synagogues. And this was built with help from the American Joint Distribution Committee, the restoration of it. Now, you're going to see when we go to Corfu, we have the same setup there with the synagogue. Coffins should not be brought into a sanctuary. So in a lot of the Romaniote synagogues, the ground floor was, if there was a funeral, that would be where the coffin would be brought in, and then upstairs was the sanctuary. This is the upstairs sanctuary that you go into, and this is what the synagogue looks like now. It was recently renovated, I'd say maybe 15 years ago. I sort of liked it the way it was before, but I'm a minority of one. And these are the Romaniote Torah scrolls on the right here. This synagogue is only used during the high holidays, which overflow from the main synagogue of Beth Shalom. But they will open it up when I bring my groups over, and very often Rabbi Negrin, as an accommodation to us, will actually have services there. This is Beth Shalom Synagogue, which is right across the street on Melodoni. The two synagogues are directly across the street from each other. Etz Chaim is inside the Jewish community offices. You have to walk through there to the courtyard in the back. This is Beth Shalom Synagogue, which was founded in the beginning of the 20th century. And the courtyard, you walk through, the women are upstairs, so you walk through the courtyard and you can go upstairs to the women's section. Rabbi Negrin on the right is giving us a little lesson on the synagogue there. And for some reason, they didn't, whoever the people were, they didn't want the menorah. So what they did is they created a menorah out of the lamps, because there are 7 of the lamps hanging. And then you have the traditional Sephardic Sephers, Torahs on the left, and very, very close to the synagogues is the Holocaust Memorial of Athens. This was created with a broken Mogen David, very symbolic, and each of the stones has the names engraved of all the communities in Athens, and people will stop by and leave stones in memory of where their families came from. There were some desecrations, usually stupid painting things on there that were easily removed, but just annoying to see. And there is police protection close by because there's 24 hours police protection at the synagogue, but no one can see what's happening. Athens Jewish cemetery. Okay, the Jews in Athens are buried inside the Christian cemeteries in special sections that are designated for them. There are 2 cemeteries that you'll find Athenian Jewish graves. One is in the First Municipal Cemetery, and there are 905 graves, the oldest being in 1892, the newest in 1912. And I don't think there was ever, a lot of cemeteries in the United States, you can only do certain things in the cemetery, a certain style of the tombstone. Here you'll see all different styles. And I mean, the ones in the old cemetery are really beautiful, but they're not consistent. There's all different. For some reason, the flat stones became popular at one time, the raised stones at another time. This is the Third Municipal Cemetery, and this is the new section for the Jewish burials. And there's right now, I think there's over 2,500 graves. The earliest, 1941, the newest in 2020. It's well maintained. This is a memorial to Greek Jews that died on the Albanian front. And this is their names here. As you can see, there were quite a few. This is the new section of the new cemetery. And again, you sort of did whatever you wanted to do. It was your own thing. We're now going to go over to Patras. This is not a long trip, very short car ride, about 2 hours. And there was no Jewish presence there. Now, at one time, there was a small Romaniote Jewish community there. In 1821, with the beginning of the Greek War of Independence, the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople was executed in retaliation for the Greeks rising up against the Ottoman Turks. He was hung, and his body was thrown to a Jew. I think I mentioned this in a former lecture. Very often we were given the worst jobs, and it wasn't a matter of choice. But by the time the Romans got back to the Peloponnese, the Jews had killed the patriarch. Most of the Jews fled. Many of them went up to Volos. There was a large contingency of Jews that went up to Volos. There was actually a small community not too far from Mistra that went up to the mountains, and there's a Greek Orthodox church in Brooklyn where many of the people claim that they were once Jews but were forced to leave, and they became Christians afterwards, after 1821. This is an old picture from the streets of Patras, what it looked like, and you can see by the outfits, this probably would have been around the time of the Greek War of Independence. The picture on the left is the facade of the Synagogue of Patras, and on the right is the interior. It's not there anymore. Auspiciously, Nikos Stavroulakis happened to be there when they were starting to tear the synagogue down, and he rescued the bima and the Aron HaKadosh, which now sit in the Jewish Museum of Athens. On one of my trips, David Baruch, who was born in Patras, asked Annette Batino, the museum director, if he could hold the Sefer Torah that he had used on his bar mitzvah in Patras. So that was a very memorable experience there. This is the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Patras, which is some of the graves, it's not too bad, and some of the sections are in disrepair. there has been talk of what we can do if there are enough Jews from Patras in the diaspora to get a movement going to repair the cemetery. It's never been desecrated. It's been pretty much left alone. We're now going over to Zakynthos. And for those of you who have never been to Zakynthos, make a special trip. It's a very special, beautiful island. This is the town of Zakynthos. But my favorite spot is actually the beach of the Navarone. It's a shipwreck on the beach. That's an absolutely beautiful beach. The island has a beautiful history of Jewish Christian relationships. And I'm sure most of you have heard the story of the saving of the Jews of Zakynthos due to the Metropolitan Bishop Chrysostomos and Mayor Lucas Cadere, who saved the entire 275 Jews of Zakynthos. This is a memorial thanking them for what they did. There is also, this was the synagogue in Zakynthos. This is actually the Crete synagogue. Just like in Crete, they had a Zakynthos synagogue. This was the Crete synagogue in Zakynthos. And this was destroyed in an earthquake in 1953. So this synagogue existed from 1489 until 1953. These are pictures from the earthquake. It was absolutely devastating. It was one of the worst earthquakes in Greece. It hit most of the Ionian Islands. And the picture on the left is the Mordos family that survived. The Jew, there was really very few human casualties, but there was tremendous physical destruction in the city. And afterwards, most of the Jews moved to Athens, although there were a number that went to Israel, and there's a Zakynthos synagogue in Tel Aviv. And then other Jews from Zakynthos also went to a moshav, Zor Moshe, which is not too far from Haifa. This was outside the synagogue here, and it was talking about the destruction in 1953 with the earthquake. The cemetery in Zakynthos, you know, there are times that I'm amazed. This is an island that has no Jews. True, it's an island that had very good relationships with their Christian neighbors. The cemetery, thank God, has remained untouched. It's not gated. It's not locked in. It's off the beaten track, but no one has ever desecrated it. No one has ever destroyed any of the graves. And Mr. Mordos comes from Athens to tend to the cemetery when he can. These are some of the old tombstones there. These are the gates going in to the cemetery. And in 2014, there was a monument put up in memory of a soldier, Moises Fortis, who died in the battlefield in the Albanian front. There's also a monument there for, you can't really see the writing on it, but in the back, it's Jews from Zakynthos who died in the Holocaust because they were living on other islands. You know, you often wonder about fate because there were Jews from Zakynthos that went to live in Corfu, where there was tremendous devastation during the Holocaust. There was also at one time a Jewish community of Florina that's no longer there and really was not in existence during World War II. Now we're going over to Corfu. Used to be able to go directly from Zakynthos to Corfu by plane. Can't do that anymore, so you might have to fly back to Athens and fly to Corfu, or you can just hop on the boats, like the Milkman's route, to go from island to island. It's a beautiful island, Corfu. It's very, very different from the islands in the eastern part of Greece, the Aegean, the dry islands. It's a very colorful island. It has excellent weather, lots of rain, foliage all over the place, a long season. The season starts in the beginning of April and goes very often up until November. Very warm climate. They get a lot of Italians there and a lot of Brits come. This is an old photograph of a Jewish shop, a man who made pots and pans. And these photographs are taken of the Jewish ghetto. As I said before, this was under the Venetians and they established a ghetto. I helped work on the anniversary of the ghetto in Venice, and where they claim to be the oldest ghetto in Europe dating back to 1516. In actuality, the ghetto that the Venetians established on the island of Corfu predates that ghetto by about 30 years. It was the way the Venetians thought of separating Jews from Christians so that they wouldn't be contaminated by the Jews. So it wasn't a pleasant relationship, but there were many Jews that took advantage of that connection and went to Venice for education. The buildings, again, as in most ghettos, were tall and high because you had a very limited amounts of land to live on. The picture on the right, I actually picked up in Corfu, and it said on it in Greek, a Jewish woman. And then I looked upon a series of photographs in a Photoshop that some man had handed in of all Jewish photographs of Jews. Evidently, someone found them fascinating and photographed them. So this is a pot seller over here and a very elegant woman. The Jewish population of Corfu was a mix of the indigenous Greek-speaking Romaniote Jews, and then Jews that came from Apulia in Italy. So the patois, the dialect that was spoken by many of the Jews on the island, was a mixture of Pugliese Italian, Greek, Spanish, and Hebrew. At the time of World War II, there were 4 synagogues. 3 of them were from the Pugliese, and one was La Scuola Greca, the Greek synagogue. This is, on the left is an Aleph from Corfu, and on the right is a Hanukkah, which I thought would be very appropriate for this lecture since we're so close to Hanukkah. This is a prayer book, and as you can see, written in Greek, and on the right is the Hebrew. To my shame, I could read the Greek, and I can't read the Hebrew. These are photographs from the Jewish community of Corfu, David and Rosa Veleli. Veleli was a very common name of Jews from Corfu, and because of the Vita, what is actually people think of as the Greek B, but it's pronounced as a V. In Italy, many of the Velelis became Belelis, and the same thing in this country. And on the right is a picture of Eliezer, Avram Eliezer, who was related to the Gabalides family, May Gabalides, and I thank her for this picture. There were 2 fortresses in Corfu, both Venetian fortresses. And this is the new fortress, which is very close to the entrance of the Jewish community. If you went around this way, you'd get into the Jewish community. Then there was the old fortress. And this fortress is where they kept the Jews when they rounded them up on the night of June 9th into the 10th of 1944. Overriding German high command, the Gestapo arrested the Jewish community, brought them to the fortress, and kept them there for a couple of days. They would send out, they requisitioned small boats, and they would send out the Jews to go to the mainland, either Patras or Ioannina, where they would wind up at a camp called Haidari, which was a military base outside of Athens, where they were kept for a number of days before they were put on trains to go to Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's said that by the time the Jews of Corfu reached the camp, the only sound that was heard when they opened the cattle car doors was the sound of silence. With their weird sense of humor, the first boat that left were pregnant women with a doctor on board, as if they really cared about the women. This is an old picture of the synagogue, actually before the war. And you can see some of the Jewish neighborhood around there. This is 2 former synagogues that were Pugliese synagogues that the Jews that came from Apulia in Italy worshipped at. And this is from the 3rd synagogue, the Pugliese synagogue. This shows some of the damage with the bombing. And this is the present synagogue, La Scuola Greca, the Greek synagogue, which is the only one that survived. It's an absolutely beautiful synagogue. This is the interior. It's undergone a series of restorations. It's very well kept. This is with the Torah scrolls, which are Romaniote style. And this is the Holocaust Memorial that was dedicated in 2002. On the right, you see a plaque, which you probably can't read anything on. But the association helped sponsor the creation of a memorial plaque to be put inside the synagogue in Corfu with the family surnames of the Jews that perished in the Holocaust. And we rounded up Corfiotes from all over the world who came for that ceremony of the unveiling of the plaque. And at the same time, the unveiling of the Holocaust Memorial. The Holocaust Memorial was put in a very safe spot. It's very close to a police station over there. It's never been vandalized. The cemetery, the old Jewish cemetery in Corfu, was destroyed in 1891. There was a blood libel accusation on the island of Corfu, one of the only ones that ever happened on Greek soil. And the irony of it is the young girl that was found murdered was not Christian, she was Jewish. But rampage started, they tore through the ghetto, destroyed property, destroyed the Jewish cemetery. This was the old cemetery here. And half the Jewish population of Corfu left in 1891. Many of them went up to Trieste, and many of them went to Egypt, to both Cairo and Alexandria. And then after Nasser, many of those Jews in Egypt wound up in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And there's still a very strong Corfiote Jewish presence there. At our reunion in 2002, they came from as far away as Australia, from Brazil, from Argentina, from Spain, from all over, and we had a very nice American contingent also. This is the new cemetery in Corfu, and the graves are in good repair, with the exception of old tombstones that were taken from the old cemetery. Now, I see Elliot Colchimero is here, and Elliot did me a favor one year where I was trying to get these stones protected. So I had Elliot pose as a very famous expert on cemetery preservation. And he had a delightful meeting with the president of the Jewish community, because I knew Lena wasn't going to speak to me. But as soon as he heard that Elliot was a professor of engineering, because Lena was also an engineer, and had come all the way from the United States, I almost got whiplash with how fast he turned his back on me. And then Elliot said, and told him all the details of what he had to do to preserve the stones. By the way, Elliot, he never did any of it. We're now going to go up to a city that's very close to my heart. And I often say my roots are in Salonika, but my heart is in Ioannina. I save Ioannina for last. This is the Lake of Ioannina, Lake Panviotis. And I find it such a magic city. You know, this picture was taken in the 1940s, but it could be today when the mist rise up and the city comes alive. It takes on a special feel. These are some old pictures. The one on the right is actually a Jewish-owned coffee shop or cafe neon, and talking to a Christian military man there. And the one on the left is a Jewish family gathering straw. For what, I don't know. The lake, the iconic lake. The lake, they would wash their clothing and the children would play in the lake. When I have my Yanotis who come to visit there, they all have these stories they heard from their nonas, and all they want to do is jump into the lake, and it's not the place to jump into now, not with all the boats on it. The picture on the right is taken before 1912 when there were still minarets in Ioannina, and shows the Turkish influence there. And this is one of the bizarre areas in Ioannina. This was the senior home in Ioannina. You know, there was no need for a senior home until immigration took place, because before that, you would never put your elderly parents in a home. There was always a brother or a sister in the family that would take care of them. But once everybody started to leave, what were they going to do? So they built the home. Here, I'm showing you, if you look down the street there at the very end, that's where the second synagogue in Ioannina was. It was built outside the Castro walls, and they actually would call those that worshiped there the outsiders, not meaning outside or anything, but they lived outside. And the plaque on the left is a plaque that was recovered from that synagogue. There's a series of plaques that are now housed inside the synagogue in Ioannina that were saved from the old synagogue. And they vary. There are some that, there's one that's from the old man Batino, who wanted his name somewhere in the synagogue. And since he didn't have any children, he created a plaque for himself. This is the present synagogue in Ioannina, and on the right you see where they set up the sukkah, because it was usually a communal sukkah. And this is in the entranceway, and the synagogue dates back to 18 something. I can't make out the Hebrew letters there. I'm sure someone will correct me on it. But again, in this instance, there would have been a synagogue on this site going back centuries, but they were only allowed to build on one site at that point. The synagogue is located inside the Castro walls. This is the entranceway, and along the side there you'll see on the right, that was the entrance for the women. There was a women's balcony which has been out of use for a long time now. It's just too precarious. But inside the synagogue, what would happen is the women would sit on one side, the men would sit on the other side. It's set up in the traditional style of a Romaniote synagogue. It's a typical Ottoman style synagogue with high ceiling, natural light coming in. On the left where you see the chandelier, that's a recent addition in the 20th century from a member of the Ashkenazi family. And so bar mitzvahs would take place on the raised platform, the beamer at the far western wall, and then the desk in the middle would be for smaller services that they would use. This is a better picture you can see of the interior of the synagogue. And you can notice over here some of the plaques that are up with the names of those that perished in the Holocaust. This was sponsored by Michali Matza and Leon Kabali, who gathered the names of 1,851 Jews who perished in the Holocaust and had their names engraved in stone on the walls of the synagogue. It goes in alphabetical order according to the Greek alphabet. So this plaque over here is Liasco, and then you have matzah, many, 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 many matzahs. These are photos from the deportation of the Jews of Ioannina. A German paratrooper took these photos. He captured the pain and the anguish of the community. This photo of the young woman just screamed to me. I wanted to find out who she was. I wanted to find out if she had survived, because I said I would dedicate our Holocaust exhibits to her. I did find out because of the internet. We had these pictures up on the internet. And after Fanny died, her granddaughter got in touch with us. She explained that her grandmother lived in fear that people would know that her children and grandchildren were partially Jewish, and she feared for them that they would share the same fate that her family had shared. I wrote an article and it was published, and the Holocaust education in Great Britain now includes the story of Fanny Chaim to show that when the Holocaust ends, the pain doesn't necessarily end. This picture here, recently we lost Stella Cohen. This is Stella on the day of the deportation. This is showing that she's getting onto the open wagons that they used. The Jews were rounded up on March 25th. March 25th was a popular day for deportation of the Jews. It was Greek Independence Day, and they wanted to show the Greeks how meaningless their concept of independence was. They rounded the Jews up. It was a cold, wintry type of march. It was right before Pesach. It was snow on the ground. They were given a short amount of time to gather together some possessions, And then they were loaded into open wagons, taken across Greece to the city of Larissa, where they were kept in a warehouse, stripped of their jewelry and their money, and then afterwards put on trains to go up to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Of those that were rounded up, close to 2,000 in the community, 1,851 perished. There were approximately 151 Jews that survived, some from the camps, some in hiding in the mountains. This is the Holocaust Memorial in Ioannina, dedicated by the city of Ioannina. A lot of the early memorials were done by the municipalities themselves. This is Mr. Mattathias, and I know that Rose Addis is somewhere in the audience. This is Rose Addis Ferrara, and she's related to Mr. Mattathias. And so often, some of the most meaningful moments that I have on the trip is when people find family. How do you like this one? This is Stella Cohen meeting a relative, Rachel Service from the Ashkenaz family, and due to DNA research, they found out that they're related to each other. I mean, look at her mother in the back. That's what I feel like doing now. This is Penny Santiago with Stella. She was Stella's sister, Eftikia, was related to Penny because Penny's grandmother was from the Svoli's family and came to the United States. And so when Penny went there, she was able to visit. Eftikia was no longer alive. Ebby was no longer alive, but she was able to visit with Stella. Some more moments. Finding the house where your family lived. We can do a lot of these things in Ioannina because we've established a very, very strong relationship with the community of Ioannina, not just the Jewish community. They know when we're there. They recognize us in the streets. And this house we knew had belonged to Varon. She was actually born into the Moises family. And what happens is the woman saw us. She inquired what we were there about, and we mentioned that this woman was related to the family that had owned the house next door. Well, next door, her daughter had bought the house, so she had the key, and she was able to let us in and go inside, and you can see the gratitude here. I know Richard Matzer is in the audience. This is his grandson, who in Ioannina was given the honor of holding the Torah scroll. And again, when I have, I know Lois, you're there somewhere. I saw you in the audience. But when I have my people from Ioannina come over, they carry photographs that I print out for them of their family that left to come to the United States. And then they're returning now and letting the Jewish community of Ioannina know of their connection. This was a particularly special group because I had much of the board of trustees from our community that were with us, and I had large numbers from the Negrin family also. The cemetery in Ioannina, this is the third cemetery. The first cemetery was right outside the Castro walls, but because it became part of the city, very often Jews had to move their cemetery. So there was a second cemetery, and then this was the third cemetery that was land that was given by Ali Pasha to the Jewish community. And at one time, the municipality wanted to reclaim that land, but we were able to prove ownership of it. Most of the graves look like this. But a couple of years ago, there were a group of Israelis that were there that were working on cleaning up the cemetery, and they found two tombstones, the oldest dating to 1426. These were tombstones of rabbis that had been brought from a former cemetery over, but because of the age of these tombstones, the cemetery became an historical landmark in the city, which we thought was great until the Byzantine center told us we couldn't touch anything there. And Allegra Master said, "What do you mean? We put stones on our gravestones." So they allow us to put the stones on now. This is the Holocaust Memorial in the cemetery in Ioannina. Inside here are ashes from Auschwitz-Birkenau. And people come, and when we have a group, they put their stones down there in memory. I want to thank you all very much. This was a long trip. I don't know about you, but I'm very tired. And this is contact information in case you have any additional questions that we don't get to. I'm going to go out of, I'll leave this up here just for a moment, Andrew, while you talk to the people, okay?
Marcia, thank you so much for the wonderful three-part series. We're going to have a few moments for questions before we get into those. And we want to just take a few moments because it's a little late, but we want to appreciate everybody's time. And thank you all so much for being with us. Just two quick notes before we begin with questions. I'm going to put into the chat box a brief survey for this class series. We asked after each class series for you to take a quick 1-2 minute survey just to give us some feedback. We'd love to hear what you thought about this series. It'll help us improve in the future for other series and other classes as well. So again, that link is in the chat now, so please click on it. It takes 1 to 2 minutes. In addition to that, as I've said before in the past, all these programs are a nonprofit initiative. We don't look to make money off of these. As you can see, they're all free. We would appreciate any support you can give, especially as the year rounds out, both to Kahal Kadosh Ioannina and the Sephardic Brotherhood. I'm putting in the chat also a direct PayPal link if anybody is interested in donating. We greatly appreciate any support you might be willing to give us. Thank you so much. Now, let's go through a couple of questions for Marcia.
What do we have? Are there any special foods eaten by Greek Jews different from traditional Jewish and Greek foods? Most of the foods we eat are more similar to Greek foods, although we accommodate them to those of us that observe kashrut, to a kashrut diet. They're very different from Ashkenazi foods.
Another question here regarding specifically, what was it? Have the memorial, maybe you can talk a little about the memorial in the Jewish cemetery of Salonika, the one that was in the original cemetery, and why it was slanted. Someone was a bit confused.
Oh, that's how they chose to do it. I mean, that was to give a dramatic design to it. It wasn't anything that was negative. It was just whoever designed it was creative. I do see here, why would you give up a cemetery? I would never give up a cemetery. It wasn't me that gave up a cemetery. They gave up the cemetery. And who am I to argue? You know, I've learned over the years in visiting Greece, I have the luxury of living here. I don't live in Greece, and what they have to live with may be very different. I can't complain to the leadership of the community. I'm not a member of the community, and I know with all that they've been through, it was after World War II, there were so many wounds that had to be healed, that if they felt it was more important. Now, the cemetery in Salonika was given up to raise ransom money, to ransom the men that were taken for forced labor, many of whom were dying. So it was that was the rationale of raising the money to ransom those men. Of course, it was futile because shortly afterwards they were deported. Is there an historical society of Salonika among the Jews? There's the Brotherhood, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, that really incorporated initially the Salonika Burial Society. There's not an historical society. I don't know about a general society. I know many Greeks have special societies. Okay. My grandfather is buried in Athens. I don't remember where he's buried, but I have a record somewhere. If you give it to me, I'll find out from the Jewish community of Athens. What else do we have here? Thank you. It's always a joy to hear from you too. Okay. You should be aware that Rabbi Angel wrote a lot about the Jews of Rhodes. I have his book. It was excellent, and he's a good friend of ours, by the way. He spoke at our synagogue. He presented his most recent publication. And if you get our e-newsletter, I always have something in there, the Parashah of the week, from him and from Rabbi Nisim Anakave, along with Rabbi Gerson from Israel. The classes are all recorded. You can go on to the Facebook page of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. I believe Ethan is working on getting them on YouTube eventually.
As we say in Ladino, avagar, it takes a little time,
right.
So
okay.
have some patience.
Okay. When did Salonika reach out for artifacts? The call for the establishment of the museum was in the 1980s originally, and that's when they realized they were going to have a problem. Initially, the museum used stories from the Ashkenazi world until Nikos Stavroulakis came in the 90s to actually establish the museum, and then it became our story. Okay.
Marcia, there's a question regarding the new center being built in Salonika. Maybe you want to mention that.
Right. The center is going to be more than just a Holocaust museum. It's going to be an educational center. And we, the association has given funds over the course of the years, but the main funding has come in from two sources now, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and from the German government. David Saltiel went to Germany, spoke there, and showed them photographs of railroad tickets that the Jews had to buy from the Germans to bring them to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and embarrassed the Germans to giving, because they said they're finished with reparations, they're finished with this. Well, they gave, I think it was 10 million euros towards the establishment of the Holocaust Education Center. That's how it's formally called. There will be a small museum in there, and David Saltiel approached me to see if there are any Romaniote artifacts that we could give. I said, of course, it's going to be a museum to educate people about the story of Greek Jewry and the story of the Holocaust. It will educate the citizens of Greece, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and citizens from other parts of the world. There will be guest lectures, and there also will be a Jewish school as part of the center. So it's quite an ambitious project. Anything else? Did I miss?
I see one last question here, Marcia. Is there a way, it's an interesting question, if people who can claim Greek Jewish heritage, is there a way for them to claim Greek citizenship?
Good luck. Okay. Okay, this is the story. We don't have it that easy. According to Greek law, if you can have one Greek grandparent, you are entitled for dual citizenship, to claim Greek citizenship. This is the process. You have to work backwards. You have to prove that you were the legitimate child of your parents. Easy, hopefully. And then you have to prove that your parent, which one or two was the legitimate child of your grandparent, which a lot of times you're born in the United States. That's good. Now we get difficult. They want a baptismal certificate from the person who's born in Greece, and we don't get baptized. They want the church record of the marriage, and we don't get married in the church. So we've gotten them to realize that this is really very upsetting for us to be asked these type of questions. So they're supposedly getting more amiable with this. I know it took Isaac close to 7 years, and that's with living in Ioannina, to get his citizenship. But try. You know, you have to go to the consulate. They'll give you papers to fill out. All of your papers have to be translated into Greek. And try. You know, a lot of people are now going for Portuguese citizenship as a way of getting. You know, I was inundated with requests for Greek citizenship before the elections, and but I don't try. Maybe you'll have. I cannot do it. You know, Daniela, you'll understand this, your family coming from Thessaloniki. I don't have records. My records were lost in the fire of 1917. So I can't go back that way at all. I mean, I can go, my grandfather, yeah. Was he born in Thessaloniki? Of course he was. So were my two grandmothers, but there's no records because of the fire. They say that some of the municipal records are there. Not for my family. Daniela, did you try with yours? Yeah. Okay. So you ran the same block as I did. But
one last question here, and then I think we'll wrap it up. What's the status of the Romaniote language, or is there even a status currently for it?
Okay. It's called Yavanim. And okay, there's two separate things. Liturgically, it was a language that was Hebrew written in Greek letters. Which very similar to Ladino, which was Hebrew written in the Rashi script. But the spoken language was actually a dialect that was spoken by not only Jews, but also Christians in the city. And it was a mixture of Greek, Hebrew, and Turkish. So like a common expression, if you were wishing that your son would get married, would be Nasad Rixel to Taleth. I should mashallah, talef. In other words, mashallah, God willing, I should see you wrapped in the talef, which was the traditional way that they would get married. But it's, it's fun. It's not really spoken now, but when I have some older people from my group who come there, the old people in the city, not just the Jews, but the old people in the city all gather around because they want to hear them speak, because that's how their grandparents spoke, the same language. Also, the notis have a habit of cutting off the word, either at the beginning or the end. So, for instance, when we were publishing Eftekia Nachman's book, she used the word, instead of Bechor for the firstborn, she used Hor, H-O-R. And I said, Eftekia, we can't do that because that's different in English to have Hor, And she argued with me, but that's what we called it. So we had a footnote that. But they had a habit of cutting off their words either at the beginning or the end.
Okay, with that, I want to thank Marcia so much again for this wonderful 3-part series. As always, mashallah, we had 230 people turn up for this final class.
Oh, beautiful, mashallah.
Indeed. Thank you all so much as well. Just a reminder, we put into the chat 3 important links. The first one being the survey, a quick 2-minute survey to get your feedback. We'd appreciate that info. The second link is a donation link to donate to the Sephardic Brotherhood. And the third is a donation link to donate to Kahal Kadosh Ioannina. Please give if you can. We know obviously it's a difficult time, but if you are able, please support us. We greatly appreciate it. With that, I want to thank you all so much. Wish you all a nochada buena, a good evening, kalinichta, a good evening, and thank you all so much. And thank you, Marcia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tim. Hi, Renee. It's so good seeing all these faces, really.